Family. It's good to see everybody out this morning. This is your weekly reminder that at the Marshfield Church of Christ, we are committed to glorifying God and uplifting one another through worship, spiritual growth, outreach, fellowship, and service to the community. And we believe that that goal is achieved by loving God and loving one another. As mentioned by Phil, if you're using a Pew Bible, our main passage this morning will be on page 1027. I mentioned on Wednesday night, for those who are here, there's been a case that's had national news over the past couple weeks about a young man named Botham Jean and the woman who murdered him. And some people are aware of this and some people aren't. He was a member of the church. He was a graduate from Harding, and one of mine and Cora's friends actually was in school at the same time as him and was in one of the choral groups there with him at Harding. And for those of you who haven't been keeping up with this, basically what happened is there was an off-duty police officer. She went into his apartment thinking it was her own. There's a question if alcohol was involved. She made the assumption that there was somebody who had broken into her apartment and shot and killed this young man. He was in his apartment. So she was confused about where she was located. My understanding is apparently there's this question about the layout of the apartment complex was complicated, and if you were a bit inebriated, there was a possibility that something like this could have happened. Regardless, over this past week, she was charged with murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Now, that alone is not a very good story, but kind of some of the things that have come out of it have shown the type of Christian love that we need to show to people whenever they do something wrong. And I mentioned on Wednesday night, Botham's younger brother was seen on the stand saying to Amber, that's the name of this lady, that he forgives her. The funny thing to me is people have tried to make this out as something having to do with race, something having to do with some weird religious cult type thing, that he was disingenuous. It's funny to me that forgiveness is so rare in our culture. Our first response is try to explain away that the person was actually trying to forgive them. That it's not about somebody actually wanting to forgive this person. It has something to do with race or some other ulterior motive. That's how rare we've gotten with forgiveness in this country and in this world. And if you think about it, we've almost condensed forgiveness down to cliches. You probably heard the one about forgive and forget, right? Every time I hear somebody having a discussion about the whole forgive and forget thing, they don't really talk about the forgive part. They talk about the forget part. Because in their minds, they've taken those things to be somewhat equal. That for some reason, unless you actually forget about it, you haven't actually forgiven them. We've changed the definition because the actual forgiveness is so rare, we have lost the meaning of it. We don't understand it. And whenever we actually see somebody truly forgive somebody for wrong, it's so odd to us we don't know how to react. So the media takes it and makes it something that it's not. I have needed forgiveness a lot of times. Now, that means one of two things, right? Either I apologize a lot or I screw up a lot. One of the two things. I remember very distinctly whenever I was in residency, there was this one time that I didn't not set an alarm. I actually slept through the alarm completely for about an hour and a half. I had been helping something the night before, and I was so tired that I had slept through an alarm for, I think, more than an hour. I called my attending at the time and kind of explained to him what happened. And, I was scared because this was the guy who was known for being hard, the guy who was known for being, quite frankly, a bit of a jerk. But he forgave me. And a lot of the things that I had thought about that person changed that day because he treated me differently than what I would expect. I'm sure each and every one of you have had to begin forgiven for something. If you're younger, maybe it's your parents forgiving you for, quote unquote, forgetting to clean your room. Even though you were told 6 times, for some reason you still forgot to do it. But they forgave you for that. Maybe you were, I don't know, I've never gotten a speeding ticket. Maybe you were let go by one of our police officers for having a little bit of a lead foot and had some forgiveness in that particular point. I know one time I didn't realize my tags were out, and I managed to have that forgiven. It's easy a lot of times for us to forget that we need forgiveness because most of us consider ourselves fairly decent citizens. If you have your Bibles, follow along with me here in Luke chapter 7. Starting verse 36, where Phil was reading before, one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at the table of the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with ointment. Now when the Pharisees who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of man this is, and who is touching him, for she is a sinner. As I listed up here, there's 2 types of sinners in this story. First, we're introduced to this woman. Now, this woman is not identified by name. She's simply identified as a sinner, or some versions put a sinful woman. When we talk about the ways we identify different people, being identified as a sinful person is usually not a good way to start things off. That says something about your reputation in the area where you're living. The fact that she had this alabaster flask available has led a lot of people to believe that she could have been a prostitute. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. Having this was something that would have been used by prostitutes for those people who had come to her. That does not necessitate that, based on what we have here in the scriptures. She could have went and bought this for this particular act. But there's at least some thought that could have been why she is identified as a sinner. And this was a group of people that commonly was identified as a sinner, simply that. What we do know, more than the way that she was identified by the community, was the way that she felt about what she had done. She was penitent. Most of the time, whenever people are in these sorts of situations, it's either because their husband had died or their husband had left them. And she was probably doing whatever it took to survive. But notice, she realized it was wrong. She didn't justify it, but it was all that she knew how to do. So we have a penitent sinner. Second, we have Simon. Now, you probably, as you were listening through this, it appears that Simon was the name of the Pharisee who invited Jesus to this party. That he seems to be the one who was kind of the head who decided to bring Jesus here. It's a lot easier to be a politically correct sinner. What do I mean by that? It's really easy to suffer from the sin of pride, the sin of greed, the sin of judgment, than it is for the sin of prostitution. Because one is very public. One everyone knows about. One is something that brings shame on you here in this world. The other one, self-righteousness, sometimes I wonder if we don't celebrate it a little bit. The people who, in this period of time, were the most self-righteous were the Pharisees, and they were looked up to as the religious elite. That's the people we're supposed to be trying to emulate, because they were just so holy. They knew what they were doing. They fasted. They gave. They tithed everything. They even tithed their spices. That's how religious they were. But you can see here, Simon was just as much of a sinner as this woman was. In the church today, a lot of times it's a whole lot easier to be a sinner like Simon than a sinner like this woman. Because it's very easy for us, as people who know the truth, as people who understand the Scriptures, to look down on people who don't. People tell me, I don't understand why the world is acting the way it is. The world is such a bad place. The world is evil. My thoughts are, if you read the Scriptures, isn't that exactly what you would think would happen? If you leave the people of the world to their own means, you're going to have something bad. That's the result of it. And for us, it's very easy for us to judge those people as unworthy of the cause, that they aren't good enough to have the message brought to them. They aren't good enough to be forgiven. An even scarier one, some people think that they don't need forgiveness. It's very scary to think that some people don't think that they need God's forgiveness. So Jesus tells Simon this parable. And this is one of my favorite parables. It's kind of a different spin on the parable of the unforgiving servant. But I really like when Jesus uses these sort of illustrations. So there were two men. One person had a debt that was roughly a year's and a half worth of wages, okay? If you say a denarii is about a day's wage, you do the math, about a year and a half is one guy. The other person is about 50 days' wages. The point of this story is, for most people, you only had enough at any given time to help yourself for that day. It was really hard to save money in the first century. It was really hard to put enough money back that you could save it and purchase something later. Just about everybody, not only did they live from paycheck to paycheck, they lived from day to day. It wasn't uncommon for someone to die of starvation. In our country today, we try not to let that happen. We try to help those people who are unable to, for whatever reason, sickness, mental problems. We try to help those people so that doesn't happen. Back then, it wasn't uncommon for somebody to die from just starvation. So there's these two servants. One has a fairly large sum of money. One has a slightly less. But the whole point is what Jesus says here. Neither could repay it. Neither could repay it. Whenever we think about our lives as Christians, do we truly understand that we are unable to repay the debt that we have brought upon ourselves because of the lives that we live without Jesus' blood? Whether you owe 50 denarii or 500 denarii, without Jesus' blood, you can't pay the debt. So whether it's big or small, the debt isn't something that you're ever going to be able to amass enough to pay it off. Have you ever met somebody who thinks that they're going to do enough good, that they're going to get to the point where they basically don't need Jesus' blood? That they think that by doing so many things for the church, so many things to the world, they're going to reach a point where they're good enough on their own merit. Let me tell you, I would rather have an ounce of God's grace than a ton of my own merit. Because the thing is, I can amass all of the good works that I want to, and if you don't have Jesus' blood, it doesn't matter. You are just as guilty as the prostitute. So Jesus asked this question. Who do you think loved him more? Who do you think loved him more? Simon says, well, probably the one that he forgave more. Jesus said, yeah, that's probably right. I used to do a lot of door knocking campaigns. One time I remember going down to a place called Vidalia, Georgia. Vidalia, Georgia is where the Vidalia onions come from, and they're quite good. They're better if you get them there. But I remember going through there. It's not a very large city, something about the size of Wausau. And the financial situation there of most people is pretty bad. Not very highly educated. And there's very much kind of an us and them type layout to the city. And I remember we were having one of our most successful door knocking campaigns that I can remember having while we were on that. We were having about 25% of the people that we knocked on their door want to come to the Vacation Bible School we were doing. And it was pretty amazing how good of a result we were having from that. We were going primarily, not exclusively, but primarily to mobile home parks, going to some of the subsidized housing, that sort of thing. And like I said, we were having about a quarter of the people want to come. And I remember the last night we had almost 200 people, which was the most that had ever been in that church building, which is kind of neat. But the thing that sticks out in my mind, as successful as that was, the thing that sticks out in my mind was whenever we went to the nice part of town. And we didn't get a single person who wanted to come to our VBS. It's very hard to lean on the Lord whenever you have a lot of things holding you up. Whenever you've built your own scaffolding, it's really hard to lean on the Lord. I've heard of similar things happening. One of my teachers was talking about being in Honduras, where they said, we don't go down there. It was where all the nicer cars were. It was where all the nicer houses were. And it was because those people probably yelled at them some, but those are the ones that were slamming the doors in their face. Have we ever gotten to that point where we don't think that we need God, that we don't need forgiveness? Turn back to the text here and look at verse 44. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house, and you gave me no water for my feet. But she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You do not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but he is forgiven little, loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Then those who were among at the table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to you, woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Something that doesn't always stand out to us about this story, when Jesus is talking about these things, you're supposed to wash my feet, you're supposed to give me a kiss, you give me no oil to anoint my head. These are things that Simon, as the master of the feast, should have done. These are the ways that you greet somebody who's coming to your party. He didn't do any of those. He blatantly disrespected Jesus. That's something that doesn't exactly stand out in the story, but all these things that he had done, including saying, well, he's not really a prophet, he had no respect for Jesus, and it really makes me question why he even invited him based on the way he treated him. But here Jesus says something to this woman. Your sins are forgiven. The peace that comes with forgiveness is amazing. He said it was because of her faith. And we understand that faith alone is not what he's talking about here. It was the faith that she put into action, and that's how we have to live our lives. We have to be willing to forgive. We also have to be willing to ask for forgiveness. What does forgiveness look like to you? Is forgiveness the cop that let you go? Is forgiveness hugging the woman who murdered your brother? Is forgiveness giving your child a second chance? Is forgiveness being able to come home after you know you've done something wrong? What does forgiveness look like to you? Does forgiveness look like two outstretched hands in the crown of thorns? Each and every one of us has a debt that we can't pay. But by God's grace, we don't have to pay it. It's already been paid. We just are responsible to surrender to the one who paid that debt for us. It's something that's free, but it's something that's costly. You don't have to pay an amount of money in order to have salvation, but it does require of you a true change in the way that you're living. It requires us to show the same type of forgiveness to those people around us who've wronged us that Jesus showed for us on the cross. This morning, Do you need forgiveness? Do you need to have Jesus' blood cleanse your soul and make you free? It's not something we can do by ourselves. And whether you're the one who thinks that you're a sinner like this woman, or you're a sinner like Simon was, you still are separated from Jesus. Forgiveness is available this morning as together we stand and as we sing.